They handed me a cup of tea and a form and a smile that didn't reach their eyes. The form said diagnosis, treatment, recommended stay length. The smile said everything had already been decided. I read the words 3 times before my hands stopped shaking. Voluntary admission, except the signature block had my name scrawled in a handwriting I didn't recognize. My parents looked at each other like conspirators at a play's final act. Behind them, the nurse explained gently that sometimes the people who love us most know when we can't make the best choices for ourselves. I was still wearing the dress I'd chosen that morning. It had been blue, a color that usually made me feel like someone who belonged to the world. The door closed behind me with a soft, final click. My phone lived in my pocket for 20 minutes and then they took it at intake for safety. They called it a precaution. My mother called it, for my own good, when she stayed with the doctor and pretended to be concerned. My father kissed my forehead like a blessing. My name is Ava. And from wherever you're watching this, stay with me. Have you ever been treated like a stranger in your own family? They told me it would be weeks, maybe a month, if I complied. They promised therapy, progress notes, phone calls, when appropriate. I watched my parents' faces from across the room and recognized at once that there wasn't grief there, only relief. I caught my reflection in the small glass window of my room and didn't recognize the way my jaw clenched or the way my eyes had gone hard and small. The other patients called me by my first name like it was a novelty. Staff took my statements, measured my sleep, charted my appetite. The world was reduced to forms and schedules and a calendar with boxes I couldn't check. The first night I lay awake and watched a moth beat itself against the light over the nurse's station until the light flickered and a janitor came to escort it into the night. I began calculating. How long did it take for a visitor log to be checked? Could I get clothing through a therapist? Who among my friends would believe me if I called and said my parents had signed me in to keep me quiet while they made plans without me? The thought that hurt the most was that they'd taken my brother, not because he had a crisis, but because he deserved sun and luxury and their attention. He left with their bright bags, sunglasses, the kind of laughter that belonged in summer and brochures. They told him a surprise. They told me it was, for my own good. I learned the layout of the facility in 2 days. I learned when the intake nurse switched shifts. I learned which window had the smallest gap to the courtyard. I learned which officer at the hospital left his keys in his locker. I learned how to listen like someone harvesting small advantages. On the 3rd night, while everyone slept, I pressed my ear to the wall and heard my mother laugh across the phone, a sound that meant she was plotting a life without me in it. I decided then that I wouldn't be someone's inconvenient secret, and the decision tasted like cold metal and something very clear. I started making a plan. But first, I had to disappear in a place designed for people who couldn't. They told me voluntary admissions could be rescinded by the patient at any time, but only after a 72-hour evaluation. That was the technicality everyone cited like scripture. What they didn't say was how easy it was to be gaslit into thinking 72 hours was the world. I sat through group therapy and answered questions like a parrot, neutral and bland, while I collected names and habits and the exact time the evening nurse did rounds. When they came to ask about family, I told the truth but in fragments. They said it's for my own good. A therapist wrote it down and nodded like she was cataloging a symptom. Outside, my brother posted photos of the ocean. I saw his sunglasses and my mother's hand on his shoulder, a picture captioned, "Family Time," and the ache in my chest was so precise it made me dizzy. My father sent a text to a family group chat, "We did the right thing." My name appeared as if it were detachable from the person who shivered on the other side of the glass. There was emotion in the staff, sometimes, genuine, exhausted empathy, but the facility lived by protocols. I used that. I learned which forms required a guardian's signature, and which required only the patient's consent. I learned which phone calls were monitored and which were private. I tracked the shifts when my parents would call in and which nurses would unthinkingly say, "She's doing better," as if they were reading from the same script. I began to save details in my head like a hider stores seeds, dates of appointments, the model of the car that brought them, the nurse who joked about that same car in the smoking area. I memorized the number of the porter on duty and where he parked. I watched the way the security guard checked the exits, not out of paranoia but out of arithmetic, 2 guards during the day, 1 at night, a camera coverage map with a blind spot by the south stairwell. At night I wrote letters I never sent. To my brother, "You left with their son, you left me with their excuse." To my mother, "Did you ever hold me when I was small and know my name?" To my father, "Do you remember my laughter like it belonged to your property?" I folded each paper into the shape of a plane and then tore them, because hope needed to be limited to keep the edges sharp. A friend from college, someone who knew me before the blue dress and before the neat life my parents liked to display, found a way to visit. She showed up with a look that said she believed me, and that's dangerous and rare in equal measure. She said, quietly, "You can call me when you get out." It was a lifeline and an indictment. If I wanted to get out before whatever plan they had finished its work, I would need leverage. Leveraging meant evidence. Evidence meant access to things I wasn't supposed to have, emails, bank statements, a signed power of attorney that smelled faintly of my mother's perfume. I couldn't get those from the hospital, but I could from their house, if I could get out of the facility and into a world that thought I had disappeared. I learned how to fold my face into compliance so perfectly that people mistook my patience for recovery. I let them chart my improvement. I let them lower the guard so I could test a door and measure the lock. The plan had to be slow because slow didn't spook them. The document looked official, power of attorney over my medical decisions, a custodial authorization, an addendum that allowed restricted phone access. It was the kind of bureaucratic muscle that could realign a life. The notary seal was stamped with a firm hand I recognized from the back of my father's wallet, an address I knew from childhood holidays, except the signature was my mother's and the date was before the trip they told the family was to celebrate James' promotion. I taped the corner of the page to my palm like contraband. I started to map the money. My father ran a small contracting business. It was legitimate, but the books were small-town messy. My parents had always treated money like a tool you shoved into a drawer and used when a problem required a sharp edge. I remembered a line I had overheard at dinner, "We'll set it up so she can't touch the accounts for a while." It had sounded practical then, like estate planning. Now it read like a plan. I wrote down the bank names from the mail I found in the trash, the ones my mother thought burned would hide. I noted account types and branch addresses. I made a mental ledger of where their assets lived and what paperwork would be required to access them. It wasn't glamorous: savings accounts, a small rental income, a 401k with my father's name. Nothing that would bankrupt the family, but enough to sign for a phone release and maybe a bus ticket. I had to think like someone dismantling a small conspiracy without becoming one myself. I was careful about motive. Revenge that looked like theft would be dismissed in court as criminal. Revenge for exposure and restitution needed to be surgical, legal where possible, public where necessary. I started to gather quietly, photocopies of the notarized forms during supervised visits, a photograph of the nurse's clipboard showing the intake signature, an old voicemail from my mother promising to handle things. When I asked for my mail, they said protocol. When I asked to speak to a social worker, they sent someone with a badge and a schedule. But people make mistakes. One receptionist left a stack of discharge forms on the copier. One night, while the night porter took a cigarette break and the guard walked his rounds, I slid the forms into my jacket like bread into a pocket. The adrenaline was not cinematic, it was arithmetic and breath control. It was whispering my own name to myself like a mantra: Ava, be methodical. The friend from college, Hannah, became the external node in my plan. She met me in the hospital garden and took the photos I couldn't take, snapshots of the documents, the notary seal, the intake signature. She hatched a way to scan them in a public library and seed them with a timestamp that would show I had been stripped of rights before they said I needed protection. She promised to keep copies in multiple places. I trusted her because she once stayed overnight before finals to listen to me rehearse an apology. I began to test small escapes. The first time I walked out to the courtyard unaccompanied, a therapist smiled indulgently and assumed it was part of my integration. I smoked a cigarette I didn't want and let the smoke mask the scent of fear. I told myself I wasn't brave. I was precise. On the seventh day, as rain soaked the hospital roof and a child on the adjacent pediatric wing cried, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text from my brother, a selfie of him in a resort chair, caption, "Best week ever." My stomach knotted. The same message contained another line: "Call Mom, she misses you." I considered calling my mother and telling her everything would be fine if she returned the forms. I considered burning the message. I did neither. Instead, I forwarded the photo and the notarized form to a lawyer Hannah had found online, a pro bono attorney who worked on cases of financial elder abuse and wrongful institutionalization. Proving my handwriting would be messy. If I had samples, I'd be saved. The problem was the sample they had, the one on the intake form, had been signed at the hospital, in their presence. I needed independent verification, a piece of mail, a note, anything with my signature predating the notarized documents. Hannah suggested boxes, old school applications, anything with my name that might bear my script. We combed the memory like miners. Hannah came up with an idea that felt both simple and dangerous: go through my old apartment's paperwork. I had moved back to my parents' house after a breakup the previous year, but I still had a storage locker with boxes labeled Ava, personal. Legally, it was mine. Practically, the key was in the junk drawer at my parents'. I had to get out of the facility and into a house that believed I was incapacitated. I staged a small compliance to earn trust. I agreed to see a particular therapist who liked to schedule family sessions. I asked, because I knew it would be recorded, for family therapy so my parents would come to the facility. They obliged, because it made them look caring. I memorized the schedule for family hours and the entry log. On the day my parents came, they arrived in the late morning, sun polished off their faces. The session was perfunctory. My parents smiled and told the therapist about our concerns and a future plan that involved moving some accounts into a conservatorship. They spoke like people discussing carpeting choices. While the therapist took notes, I excused myself to use the restroom and didn't return for 30 minutes. I had learned that the visitor sign-in book sat by the front desk, under a bowl of candies. I walked into the lobby like I belonged and asked an orderly for a glass of water. The orderly got distracted talking to a nurse about an insurance hiccup. I opened the drawer, found an envelope with my name on it, and inside, an old letter I had written to a landlord when I was 21, signature trembling and unmistakably mine. I photographed it with my palm under the pretext of checking dates. It was enough. Hannah ran the handwriting through a comparison service the lawyer recommended. It wasn't forensic court admissible yet, but it was a start. The lawyer filed an emergency petition for temporary release and to void the notarized power of attorney pending a hearing. The petition demanded an independent handwriting analysis and an injunction preventing any further transfers from accounts in my name. The hospital, predictably, called the move administrative and asked for 24 hours to respond. When my parents were served with the injunction papers, their faces did not twist in shock. They were careful owners of composure. They treated legal notices like invitations to a show. My father said, coolly, "Whatever you need," into the phone while my mother arranged her scarf like someone placing props. I watched them from the visitor window and felt a cold clarity. They always practiced for public displays. But legal motions take time and the hospital bureaucracy runs slow. The injunction froze accounts but didn't automatically free me. The hearing date was a week away. I could wait for the lawyers' wheels to turn, or I could accelerate things in a way that would force their hand without breaking the law. I created a different kind of pressure point. I started to reach out to people my parents cared about, a cousin who did their taxes, the contractor who subcontracted with my father's firm, the woman who ran my mother's book club. I sent them copies of the petition and a short message: "You might want to know. People don't like half-truths when they involve their own reputations." A cousin called back immediately and asked for details. The contractor paused a payment and asked for documentation. My mother's book club, embarrassed by the prospect of gossip, suggested a private conversation. The small social tremors spread in ways bank freezes could not. The knock at the door was deliberate, not frantic. It carried a weight that made the dogs in their backyard start to bark and then quiet. My parents' neighbor, an older woman with a sharp memory for faces, would later describe the way my mother opened the door like someone surprised their house was suddenly public property. An inspector's clipboard, a quiet voice asking for a moment. It didn't seem like the police yet. It was less dramatic than that: a man from the bank, a social worker from another county, someone in a suit with papers that suggested complication. I had thought the law would be the blunt instrument. I had not accounted for the social pressures that move people with the same care but different timing. The contractor called my father at noon to ask about a double charge he noticed and whether funds were being redirected. The cousin threatened to bring the matter up at the next family reunion. Word spread the kind of way that doesn't make headlines but makes neighbors curious. My parents' network was not infinitely loyal. They tried to contain it. They staged smiles for the contractor and civil patience for the cousin. They told their book club friends the legal action was a misunderstanding. But small-town reputations are fragile, and people prefer certainty. When the bank's risk department flagged transfers and requested identity verification, their patience wore thin. My parents began canceling plans, rearranging schedules. My mother started leaving voicemails that sounded like confessions written in parentheses. I was still in the facility, playing the role of improving patient, but now the external world was humming with friction. My father left more messages for the hospital asking about what this could possibly mean. The hospital's risk department made a call to the social worker assigned to my case. Suddenly there were extra questions at intake. Suddenly there were more staff watching me with an interest that wasn't therapeutic. The pressure had an effect I hadn't expected: panic. Panic is loud but clumsy. Late one night, I overheard, through the walls, my father and mother arguing with voices that cracked the practiced calm. "We do it for James," my mother said. "We did it because we were afraid." My father responded with a list of rationalizations: the money, the image, why it would be better for everyone. It all sounded trite until he said something that settled like a stone in my gut: "If she goes public, everything we've done will unravel." That was the beginning of a new plan on their side. It involved pressure and persuasion, lawyers and bought-in doctors, the rituals of families who believed that appearances could be maintained with the right paperwork. They thought they could discredit me, paint me as unstable, unreliable, the kind of story hospitals like to write about. They thought their investment in a clean narrative would buy them time. I realized then that waiting for a court was passive. My revenge had to be active but lawful. I began to leak pieces of evidence to people who could do more than nudge: journalists at the local paper who cover small-town corruption, an ombudsman at the hospital, a legal aid reporter who had a history of making small actions go public. Exposure is not dramatic, it's a grind of press releases and politely worded emails, but it has teeth. I had to be careful, because going public could make me a target. The lawyer warned me, you expose them, you expose yourself. I weighed risk against consequence as if calculating how many matches it would take to light a bonfire. I chose matches anyway. I provided the local reporter with a timeline, my admission, the notarized documents, the photos Hannah had taken during visits, the voicemail from my mother. The reporter asked for corroboration and then, as everyone who works for the truth does, asked for a human face. I gave them mine on a delayed schedule, written statements held at the lawyer's office. When the officer asked, my father smiled like someone who could explain anything away. She's at the hospital, he said, voice steady, as if that answered everything. He had rehearsed that sentence in his sleep. The officer took notes, polite and procedural, asking about admissions and consent forms. He left with a business card and a, "We'll look into it." That evening, the hospital informed me that there would be a temporary hold on my release for risk assessment because someone outside had raised concerns. They said it delicately, like a nurse telling you the weather. I felt the trap tighten, legal freeze on accounts, social pressure, and now the authorities asking the same questions the lawyer had. My parents tried to use the police visit as evidence that they were the ones with the problem. See, Ava isn't stable, people are worried. They staged concerned calls to my brother to check in. My brother answered, distracted by the poolside, and said, "I'm sure it's fine, because youth is a currency that buys willful ignorance." I began to document everything, not for vindication but for survival. Every call, every conversation, every movement was logged in a notebook I kept hidden beneath my mattress. Hannah came with updates from outside. The bank had frozen suspicious transfers, a small but embarrassing audit was underway, and the local paper had a follow-up scheduled. The lawyer said the police were doing their job, but that it might take time for charges or even an inquiry to produce anything tangible. Time, I discovered, had elasticity. It stretched when you needed patience and snapped when you couldn't wait. I learned to live inside a watchful hourglass. The hospital scheduled my release contingent on a psychiatric evaluation. I sat with an evaluator and answered the same questions with the same neutral tone, noticing how every answer could be weaponized. They asked about my relationships, about my ability to manage stress, about who I trusted. I answered truthfully but not vulnerably. Meanwhile, outside, my parents' small network frayed. The contractor refused to sign off on a payment. A family friend who once ran errands for my father refused to notarize anything further. Letters from the bank went to the house and were met with, "We'll handle it," voicemails that didn't inspire confidence. The neighbor who had seen the inspector made a few calls of her own. I could feel the social noose tightening in increments. The pressure produced the small, human errors that build cases. My mother, in a moment of private hurt, left a recorded message on a relative's phone that got forwarded by mistake. "If we lose the accounts, we lose everything." We did what we had to do. It arrived at the reporter's desk with a timestamp. The reporter, smelling a story with texture, came back with questions the lawyer had been waiting to see, questions the hospital's PR couldn't easily answer. I knew the next step had to be undeniable. A hearing could be delayed. An audit could take months. People could be patient or cruel as the tide dictated. I couldn't rely solely on institutions. So I did something rudimentary and human. I called my brother. I left a voicemail that was not an accusation but a ledger of memory. I reminded him of a time when we were children, when our parents read us a book until we fell asleep and my brother had fallen asleep on my shoulder. I asked him, plainly and without theater, to come see me at the hospital. He didn't answer. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. But the voicemail would be on the record. The lawyer suggested we send a subpoena for his testimony if needed. My brother's silence was not absence, it was a choice, and choices are facts you can use. On the morning of the hearing, my heart behaved like a compass wildly searching north. The judge looked tired and practical, the kind of person who believed in documents and corroboration. The lawyer presented the notarized forms, the old signature samples, the recorded voicemail, the bank's freeze notices. My parents' counsel argued stability, concern, the need for care. The judge asked questions that cut to the point: who signed the authorization? Under what circumstances? Was the patient capable? The room smelled faintly of coffee and recycled paper. The judge did something neither of us expected. He ordered a temporary order of protection for me and a full forensic review of the documents. He also issued a warrant permitting the bank to hand over records to investigators. He said, plainly, no one can use hospitalization to strip another of their legal rights unless there's clear evidence. It was bureaucracy delivering a kind of mercy. They acted like they had not been surprised by the knock. Maybe they never were surprised. Maybe they expected legal friction and had planned their rhetoric accordingly. But the people at their door were not just officers asking where I was, they were auditors, investigators, and a woman from Adult Protective Services carrying folders that smelled faintly of institutional paper. They were the kind of people who made secrecy work like a math problem and then checked the solution. I watched from the hospital window as the officers walked through my parents' house with careful steps. Hannah texted updates: they're checking the safe, they've requested bank statements, they asked about the notarized forms. The investigator asked my parents to explain the circumstances under which the power of attorney had been obtained. My father's face, which had been ironclad for weeks, cracked. He tried to explain the story they'd told the therapist: fear, concern, protection, but when faced with officers and subpoenas, his explanations had to be specific and provable. Anecdotes don't survive paper trails. The investigators found discrepancies. The notary listed a time my mother couldn't have been at the bank without witnesses complaining. An expense line appeared in the books the auditor marked as suspicious: an unusual transfer to a shell account, fees that didn't match rental income. The more they uncovered, the more the kind of small-town respectability my parents counted on frayed. My brother finally showed up. He came without sunglasses, without the resort smile. He came with the hollow look of someone who'd been halfway through a life and found it paused. He sat in the kitchen like a man summoning a memory. He asked my parents questions, the kind that have no training wheels. Did you sign her in? Did you sign my name? The answer was a hesitating wave of excuses. Facing him, my parents faltered. The witness of their child mattered in a way auditor notes never could. He looked at them and then at the folder the investigators held, and for the first time I heard real regret in his voice. You told me you were doing what's best. You told me she needed rest. He said it quietly, like someone of conscience confessing a small crime. When the investigators served my parents with a notice of potential criminal investigation for coercion and forgery, the house seemed to shrink. They were allowed to call a lawyer. They were allowed to speak. My brother, who had been complicit through blindness, agreed to be interviewed. The interviews produced a new kind of truth: inconsistent timelines, changing stories, receipts that didn't line up, a notary who couldn't recall the meeting despite the stamped seal. It was the kind of messy, human evidence that doesn't need fireworks to be lethal. I remember the feeling as the evidence accumulated, not triumph but the quiet settling of a long-held weight. I had not wanted to destroy them, I wanted my life back. But the law doesn't parse moral nuance the way people think. It parses facts. We fed it facts like breadcrumbs and followed the trail to consequences. My parents tried to bargain. They sent me letters through the hospital that looked apologetic. They promised to make amends if I would withdraw the complaint, if I would retract statements, if I would be reasonable. I read one under fluorescent light and felt pity and fury in equal measure. Their apologies were conditional, like contracts with escape clauses. I wasn't interested. They sent me the photos as exhibits and something else, a memory that complicated the ledger. In one, my brother and I sat on the steps with ice cream mustaches, hair sun-bleached and carefree. In another, my parents held a newborn me with a look that read, at a glance, like pride. Evidence can be damning and tender in the same breath. It does not instruct you how to feel about the people who raised you, only what they did. The arraignment felt clinical and final. My parents appeared with counsel who tried, in legal language, to translate guilt into mistakes. The prosecutor had a stack of subpoenas and forensic analyses. The judge read the charges with an even voice. Forgery, coercion, falsification of medical consent, the words had weight. My parents pleaded not guilty. They were released on conditional bond. The town watched, some with sympathy, most with the slow curiosity of neighbors watching a house on fire. I thought the hardest thing would be seeing them in court. It wasn't. The hardest thing was the day after, when I sat alone in a cafe and felt the silence that follows a decision. There was grief for what had been lost, not only trust but the illusion of warmth I'd been taught to equate with family. I felt grief for the blue dress, for the way my mother used to braid my hair, for everything that would now be marked by the footnotes of evidence and testimony. But there was also something else, a return. I reclaimed my apartment, step by step, with keys and paperwork. I thawed my own bank accounts. I met with a counselor who did not chart me as a diagnosis but as someone who had been betrayed and had chosen to tell the truth. I reassembled a life without their explanations. My brother did more than sit in court. He testified, halting at first, then with a clarity that surprised him and me. He told the judge about the vacation photos he had posted without knowing the cost, about the messages he had shrugged off because he preferred the comfort of their version. He later called me and apologized in a voice that was steadier than the day we were children. Whether he would become the person I needed him to be would take time, but the fact he had shown up at all mattered. The legal process dragged like winter but arrived at a reckoning, misdemeanor charges reduced to probation for some, a restitution order for a portion of what had been rerouted, mandatory counseling, and a community service requirement. The court did not grant me the triumph of seeing them behind bars, the evidence didn't warrant that level of punishment, and the law rarely delivers poetic revenge. It did, however, give me back my autonomy and make them accountable in public in a way that mattered. Justice, in this instance, was procedural and human. After the hearings, there were quiet things that marked a new normal. My parents moved into a smaller house where their routines could no longer hide. My brother called more often. He came over one evening with the same awkwardness of someone who has learned how to be cautious with affection. We ate under a thrifted lamp and did not speak of court. We spoke of small, ordinary things, the neighbor's new dog, the recipe passed down from my grandmother. It was ordinary and therefore exquisite. I confess I wanted a theatrical ending where they begged on their knees or the town shunned them with righteous fury. That didn't happen. What happened was quieter and, in the long run, better. I got my life back. I got to choose who stayed in it. The police knocking at their door wasn't the climax, it was one inevitable turn in a long arc of accountability, built from paper and witness and the stubbornness not to be erased. I still keep the blue dress. Sometimes I put it on and look in the mirror to remind myself that my name is mine and that no signature on a single sheet of paper can change the fact of who I am. The last time I saw my mother, she stood on the porch and offered a hand that trembled. I didn't take it. I said instead, "Take care of yourself," and watched the old scripts fail to find their lines. If you've ever been treated like a stranger by the people who should have loved you first, know this: it's possible to weigh the risk, to gather facts, and to choose a path that is ruthless only to deception and gentle to yourself. The law won't make you whole, but truth does a kind of mending that paperwork can't undo.